My name's Anne Taylor, and I chair the Hansard Society at the moment, and I have first of all to give you some housekeeping advice, which I'm sure you're all very aware of, but we do have to do it. First of all, can you all make sure you've got your phones turned to silent or turned off? And just to tell you that there is a photographer in the room. The event is being video recorded, but it won't be live streamed, but it will be available on the Hansard Society website tomorrow. And there are some tweets going around for those of you who feel the need. Not all of us do, but for those of you who feel the need, you can tweet via the Hansard Society. Ruth will correct me. There's a hashtag as well, PA. What's it say here? PA75 is the hashtag on the Hansard Society. So for those of you who feel inclined to tweet, that's what it is. So welcome to everyone. It's very glad to get such a good attendance, and I don't think it's just because it's a very topical subject. I think people do understand the value of the Hansard Society and the work that it's done over many years. This month is actually the 75th anniversary of the Society's journal, Parliamentary Affairs, exactly 75 years, so that's quite a distinction. And I think in the audience tonight we've got people who have contributed to that journal and indeed contributed on the topic of the House of Lords. Going right back to the beginning, people were arguing, talking, discussing what should the House of Lords be doing, who should be in it, and how should it balance with the House of Commons. Not everybody agrees, and maybe we'll hear from some of those people this evening. The Hansard Society, as you know, is non-partisan. We have got members on the council, on the board from all political parties, and over the years there has been a lot of cross-party interaction and many productive journals and articles and reports written by the Hansard Society. So I hope you will all sign up to be members and keep in touch and look at the work that Ruth and her team are doing. But tonight we have actually got a very important event. Lord McFall, John McFall, that as we have known him for a long time still say, has decided that this will be his first big speech on the role and the future of the House of Lords. Now, this event was actually scheduled for September, so it's not just a response to recent events. It's very timely, but you know, the idea came first, and John is actually responding. So without any more ado, John's a very experienced parliamentarian, as many of you will know. You've worked with him in the Commons, you've seen what he's been saying as the Lord Speaker. And I think we're very privileged in the Hansard Society to be able to host your speech this evening, John. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, Anne, thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm grateful to Dr. Ruth Fox and the staff at the Hansard Society for rearranging the speech for tonight. As Anne said, it was originally designed for September, but postponed when Her late Majesty passed away. So I've rewritten the speech about 3 times in order to reflect the context. However, I can assure you that my key message on the future of the House of Lords would have been the same if I had delivered it then or even last year. But the context has changed, with a report published this week proposing abolition of the Lords and generating extensive media attention. Folks, the irony is lost in me that the author of that report appointed me to the House back in 2010. So thanks a bunch, Gordon, on that. But as Lord Speaker, I am impartial. It's not for me to put forward my own specific proposals for the future of the House of Lords tonight. However, what I can suggest is a framework that will help us to have a constructive and purposeful debate about the future of the Lords. So tonight, I want to begin by outlining my 2 unassailable truths regarding the current House of Lords, before going on to set out my 3 principles for considering reform of the House. So, my unassailable truths. The first one is that the House adds significant value to parliamentary scrutiny and revision and is distinct from and complementary to the House of Commons. And my second truth is that whilst the Lords is able to add value because its composition is different from the Commons, there are also issues around our composition which we need to resolve. That gives us an agenda for change, keeping what is positive in the House's role whilst responding to issues of public concern such as size and appointments. And my 3 principles for assessing reform of the Lords builds upon one another. First, that changing the composition of the House will inevitably change its role, even if there are no explicit changes in its powers. Second, that the more radical the change in composition, the more radical and unpredictable will be the resulting change in the role of the House. History tells us that incremental change has been easier to realise than radical change. And this is because reforming the House of Lords requires consensus at multiple levels. If radical reform is to be undertaken, then that's for the politicians to consider and take forward. It's not for me, as an impartial speaker, to stand in the way of any such reform. I merely stress the need for constructive engagement that can deliver the widest possible consensus. This, in turn, gives me my third principle. Let's be clear up front that we need reform proposals to achieve engagement and endorsement from the government, from political parties in Parliament, and not least from across our increasingly diverse UK population. We need to think about how to achieve this. So let's start by setting out my first truth in more detail. The Lords performs an important role and does this well. We are living through an epoch of upheaval and disruption, with the shifting forces of geopolitics, the rise of artificial intelligence, the realities of climate change, and new trends in migration. The context is disconcerting for some and unsettling for many of us. But our task as legislators is to appreciate that and to respond effectively through policy and legislation. But it's not as straightforward as that. Our public policy landscape has become more complex and interconnected than ever. Economic and non-economic shocks are entangled. The writers Martin Wolf and Adam Tooze have referred to this as a polycrisis, and the age of being able to resolve problems within convenient intellectual silos has gone. Public policy challenges and threats are bound together, testing all our thinkers and legislators. And this test is taking place at a time when our methods of communication have been revolutionised, with social media having shaped a new form of discourse, largely unattractive, which is increasingly polarised, with competing positions becoming hardened and difficult to reconcile. We hear each other, but we do not listen. But the House of Lords works well in this context. Let me give you an example. In January 2021, 7 months before the withdrawal from Afghanistan, our International Relations and Defence Committee reported that, and I quote, "The ongoing presence of US and NATO troops in Afghanistan is essential to the Afghan government's military strength and negotiating position. Premature withdrawal by the US likely to be matched by NATO powers, runs contrary to the UK's objective of securing a durable negotiated settlement. What a remarkably prescient report. It warned of the risks that withdrawal would pose to the Afghan government, the reinvigoration of the Taliban that would result from such an action, and the consequential threats to the human rights of Afghans, played out to this day. The committee was chaired by a former Foreign Office Minister and included amongst its membership a former Defence Secretary, a former UK Ambassador to the UN, and members with long experience of conflict resolution and human rights work. Their extensive inquiry resulted in the first report on this topic by a committee in either House since 2014. So my point here is that the membership of the Lords is replete with experience and expertise. I have chosen just one example of our select committees in action, but there are many others. Think of the Economic Affairs Committee inquiry in social care funding, Lord Patel's Committee on Long-Term Sustainability of the NHS, which incidentally the government adopted as its white paper a year or two later, and the range of new committees we created after Brexit, the Common Frameworks Committees, which negotiated with the different parliaments and assemblies around the nations, the Northern Ireland Protocol and international agreements. And when I visited Dublin 6 weeks ago to address the upper chamber, the Oireachtas, I had the opportunity to speak to the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, and he commended the work of the Northern Ireland Protocol Committee, because he said it was the House of Lords exercising its global reach and its soft power. And that's what we are there for, as facilitators, not as politicians in ourselves. But the new committees that we have, they have no direct counterparts in the Commons, so therefore they fill a vital gap in parliamentary scrutiny of our international and trade relationships. So what do our committees do? They assist democracy. How do they assist democracy? By promoting better legislation and public policy. They complement the work of the House of Commons committees, which are largely focused on departmental scrutiny and often undertake shorter inquiries on topics of high immediate impact, with membership drawn from MPs who have many other demands in their time. I know that myself from personal experience, having chaired the Treasury Select Committee for 10 years. And the media was a big issue in our deliberations. Our committees in the Lords also enhance legislative scrutiny, enriching and informing consideration of new laws in a way that is not replicated in the Commons. Take, for example, our Delegated Powers Committee, our Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, and our Constitution Committee, ably chaired by Anne. They have done much to highlight the critical importance of the balance between primary and secondary legislation as the foundation of the relationship between Parliament and the government. And whether it's Henry VIII Acts or ever, it's been the House of Lords that has been making the running on that particular issue. So, it's in the House of Lords where the real detail of legislative proposals is considered and properly scrutinised. And this has been recognised actually by Gordon Brown's report. In the Lords, there is no guillotine on debate time, and there's no selection of amendments. So everything can be discussed. I think I well remember a few months ago a Liberal Democrat in the health bill having 100 amendments to put forward. Well, you get an hour and a half in the House of, I don't want to be abusive of the House of Commons, but an hour and a half in the House of Commons, and that's you, mate. It moves on. So, but the government makes just as much use of this facility of amending legislation as anyone. In the 2019 to 21 session of Parliament, the Lords made 1,029 amendments to government bills, but only 83 of that 1,029 amendments were the result of a government defeat in a division in the House. As demonstrated by these figures, many of the amendments agreed in the Lords results not from the opposition defeating the government, but from debate and deliberation during the early stages of legislative scrutiny. Whether on the floor of the House, in committee or wherever, ministers offer undertakings and then bring back compromise amendments at later stages. This is the high value of the civil discourse that we conduct in the Lords. The way we conduct our business improves the law of the land and serves the interests of the public and society. Ask most MPs and they'll agree that they don't have enough time to properly scrutinise legislation line by line as we do in the Lords. And I had a very distinguished senior Member of Parliament in my office just less than 2 weeks ago, and they agreed with that proposition and valued the work the Lords is doing in that area. So the capacity for this detailed work in the Commons is limited, and as I mentioned, MPs rightly busy responding to local issues and the needs of their constituents, whilst also operating within a 24/7 cycle of news and social media. Just before I left the Commons, like my colleagues, we could write a letter thanking people for their comments and looking at it with due interest. We can't do that now because it's instant response, 24/7. That's the changed environment that we're in, and we have to recognise that. But in doing the scrutiny work in the Lords, we draw upon the expertise of lawyers, judges, scientists, doctors, artists, diplomats, former cabinet members, and many other professions represented amongst our membership. For example, when Baroness Kidron is not scrutinising the online safety bill, she is off tackling the tech giants in Silicon Valley and improving children's safety online. And when she was speaking to me just very recently, she said she was accompanying the Governor of California, who was going to the White House to explain what her proposals were. And at least a dozen countries have accepted the proposition that she has made, so it's in other laws. That's the global reach of the House of Lords. When Baroness Finlay of Llandaff isn't advocating for the NHS, she's overseeing palliative care at the Velindre Cancer Centre in Cardiff. When Lord Woolley of Woodford isn't speaking up for the disadvantaged and encouraging young people to vote, he's on the front lines of education, running a Cambridge college, the first black man to do so, and one who, in his words to me, felt privileged to be in the House of Commons. Such a positive environment, he said. So what I have set out demonstrates that the Lords has the capability and the expertise to improve laws and improve lives. But our system only works because the House of Commons, who are the elected members, have the final say. Our members have the ideas, the propositions, but what's crucial is that the status of their ideas is advisory. Again, our work complements the work of the elected chamber rather than competing with it. But this brings me back to my second truth, which is that while the composition of the Lords allows us to play our unique role, the composition of the Lords is a problem. Considering this in the current context reminds me of the work of Giuseppe di Lampedusa, who in his book, The Leopard, wrote, "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. So the House of Lords has to change." And that's not Giuseppe's words, those are mine. There are questions about the future of the House of Lords, which we cannot avoid. I believe we need to see reform of an institution which is performing an important and valuable constitutional role. But the Lords should be smaller, more inclusive, and more representative of our diverse United Kingdom. I don't see the House of Lords as a London institution. I see the House of Lords as a UK-wide institution. And that's why the first act that I took as Lord Speaker in visits, I went to the Northern Ireland Assembly, I went to the Scottish Parliament, I went to the Welsh Government, spoke to their speakers and said, what we want to do is bring the politicians together, House of Commons, House of Lords, and the other parliaments, in an informal setting where we can advance our policies and try to understand each other better. It's worked beautifully, and we wish to continue that proposition. Much has been said about the size of the House, and Lord Fowler, who's here tonight, has done diligent work in bringing this into public focus. He established a committee in the size of the House, chaired by Lord Burns, who's sitting next to him, which produced sensible recommendations to reduce our size. And following the publication of the report, the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, committed to an admirable policy of restraint in new appointments. This, coupled with departures from the House, helped to reduce our numbers from 823 in June 2017 to 778 2 years later. Sadly, the same restraint was not subsequently demonstrated, and we find ourselves with 828 members, with more to come. New members are always individually welcomed. Many bring experience and new insight, but let's face it, our overall number leads to understandable public criticism. Indeed, it has been suggested to me that should there be a change of government at a future election, the new Prime Minister might need to appoint over 100 peers from their own party in order to see their legislation through the upper house. So a house approaching or exceeding 1,000 members just wouldn't function as a collective entity and have public approval. Self-regulation would fail, and the capacity for civil discourse and effective scrutiny would be fundamentally weakened. So the size of the House is important and must be addressed, but there are other important issues to consider. We have seen recent criticism regarding the suitability of particular appointments. I have emphasised that the output of the Lords is often excellent, but we cannot and do not control the input of new peers. This is a fact which we are used to explaining so wearily whenever a new list of appointments is published. The House of Lords Appointments Commission, operating from within the Cabinet, has a narrow remit to consider only the propriety of appointments rather than expertise, suitability, or the time commitment a new member might make to the House. Excellent people sit in the Commission, but it has very limited powers to challenge nominations. As Chair, Lord Bute and one of its members, Baroness Browninger, who's here tonight, Lord Bute recently made a rare public intervention about this, arguing that the inappropriate nature of recent proposals was putting the Commission, and I quote, in an uncomfortable position. Let me emphasise, membership of the legislature is a serious responsibility and brings with it a duty of public service. It is not, I repeat, it is not a reward. Our honours system has other options available for that. So there is a case for examination of the appointments process, including a more robust vetting system and stronger powers for HOLAC, ensuring that the new appointees are able to make a worthwhile contribution to the important work of the House. But an examination of the appointment system is just one element of what could be a larger package of reform, including reducing the size of the House and increasing the diversity of its members, thereby allowing us to reach out to all parts of the United Kingdom. So, having described these unassailable truths, I want now to establish a framework for constructive engagement around questions of reform of the House. And in doing so, I propose 3 principles to guide us. First, changing the composition of the House will change its role, even if there is no explicit legislative change in the powers of the House. We have heard a great deal in recent days regarding the possibility of fundamentally reforming the composition of the House and replacing it with a wholly elected chamber. The most significant reforms since the Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949 were major changes in composition, with the introduction of life peers in 1958 and the removal of most hereditaries in 1999. Each of these changes altered the composition of the House, but they also altered its character, affecting the way in which the House conducts its work. And as I said earlier, changing the composition will again influence and affect the role that it performs. But there are other suggestions for reform beyond an elected House, which would not have the same far-reaching effect on the composition. Just this weekend, for example, in an article in the Sunday Telegraph, Lord Forsyth of Drumleen, chair of the Association of Conservative Peers, suggested that a bill could be introduced to reduce the size of the House of Lords, with each group voting for a number of its existing members to remain in the chamber. In doing so, he cited the 1999 precedent in which hereditary peers voted for 90 of their colleagues to remain in a smaller chamber. In 2017, strong and clear recommendations for reducing the size of the House were set out by Lord Burns and his committee, with a package of reform which did not require primary legislation. The intention was to reduce the House to a capped membership of 600, primarily through a 2-out, 1-in approach to departures and nominations. The report enjoyed a great degree of support within the House, and there is much within it that is still very worthy of examination. But there are also proposals for primary legislation on the table. Former Chief Whip Lord Grocott has sought over many years to win support for a private member's bill to abolish hereditary peer by-elections, leading to the eventual removal of hereditary peers in the chamber. And every time there is a by-election announced, Lord Grocott entertains us with a little ditty after it, but he has been persistent on that. His attempts to win support have been largely successful within the House itself when votes have been held in his proposals. He has often won them, often with significant majorities. So this demonstrates that the appetite within the House itself for reform, a fact which is also borne out by the successful passage of the House of Lords Reform Act 2014, a private member's bill which for the first time allowed peers to retire or resign from the House. And Lord Young, who is with us, was involved in that bill. And more recently, we have debated a bill from Lord Norton of Louth, who has come early to get a front seat. He debated it last week, and that bill would address the propriety of appointments and the powers of the House of Lords Appointments Committee. His bill proposes that HOLAC publish criteria against which Prime Ministers must recommend appointments. This means that when a Prime Minister proposes a list, they would be obliged to gather evidence and present to HOLAC, setting out why each nominee would make a suitable member. This would be an incremental change rather than wholesale reform. But a series of incremental changes can in fact add up to big change over time. In 2018, the Commons Public Administration Committee, chaired by Sir Bernard Jenkin, reported in Lord's Reform, stating that, and I quote, "The experience of the last century demonstrates that only incremental reform has succeeded, while never excluding the possibility of radical reform when there is a consensus on the next essential step. Smaller incremental reforms are possible and indeed necessary and important. And in the end, these can lead to radical change over a longer period," unquote. Wise words. But there is an opportunity to contemplate reform that allows us to maintain the strengths of our membership while delivering a smaller house that better represents the modern United Kingdom. Now, the second of my three principles for reform is that the more radical the change in composition, the more uncertain the change in the role of the House. For example, a wholly elected House could present fundamental challenges and threaten both the balance of our Constitution and our capability across Parliament to deliver good and effective legislation. There are a number of questions which those who propose replacement of the Lords with an elected chamber must consider and address. How, for instance, would we address conflicts between the Houses? We are a revising chamber, and we have defined over many years a constitutional role which complements the work of the Commons. Our current arrangements allow the Lords to test the thinking of the Commons, to refine their proposals, and to ask them to reconsider. But ultimately, we defer to the elected chamber. Elected Lords would have the legitimacy to challenge and block the lower house, possibly entering into competition with the Commons rather than complementing its work. And how would we retain independent expertise in an elected house? As I have set out, our members are drawn from a wide range of professions, with many peers renowned for their knowledge, experience, and skills. When deciding the big issues, the expertise of our members is often as powerful as any whip. And I well remember being in the chamber in the European debates when we were debating Article 50, and there were different interpretations of the debates, until Lord Kerr of Kinlochard stood up and said, "I can tell you about Article 50 because I wrote it. And by the way, I wrote it with this pen." So that's the expertise that's resident in the House. And an elected Lords is also likely to mean a fundamental change to the role of the Commons. The potential for gridlock and competition between two wholly elected houses has been widely anticipated in recent debates on the subject. But beyond this, a changed upper house might also require the lower house to change how it organises its business. Certainly, it would need to devote much more time to detailed legislative scrutiny. And as a result, MPs could find they spend more of their day responding to the legislative agenda of the government and have less time for the campaigns that matter to them or their constituents. So, on to Principle 3, reform proposals. Reform proposals, if they are to be viable, need engagement and endorsement from government, from the political parties in Parliament, and not least from across our increasingly diverse population. We need to ensure that any reforms enjoy both consensus and legitimacy. Political parties win general elections on the basis of manifestos that contain wide-ranging commitments across the full breadth of public policy. Voters make their decisions based upon the issues that matter to them. While I think that the future of the Lords is important, maybe I'm not certain that it ranks above topics such as health, education and the economy for most voters. Recently, governments elected on a manifesto which promised a significant constitutional change have put these proposals to a referendum before seeking to enact them. I wouldn't like to predict the outcome of a referendum in the Lords, but as I mentioned in my visit to Dublin 6 weeks ago, I was reminded by members there that in 2013, the Government of Ireland sought to abolish the upper house of their Parliament, which is not directly elected, and they put their proposals to a public vote. The people of Ireland voted to keep their upper chamber, and the result was 52% to 48%. Now, where have we heard that before? Incidentally, I am not recommending a referendum on the future of the Lords, but I am emphasising that any far-reaching change would need to be seen as legitimate in order to guarantee the broad political support that would be necessary for delivery. We know that previous attempts at significant change, including those I witnessed while serving as an MP, illustrate that without agreement across parties, even the most worthy proposals could be found wanting. So my point is, consensus is crucial. It is not beyond the wit of our best policymakers to devise mechanisms for delivering consensus. We must have a vehicle through which options for reform can be considered calmly, acknowledging that there are issues which public opinion demands be addressed, whilst understanding our strengths and the value that we can offer to parliamentary democracy. That is why I advance this principle, to make us think about the appropriate vehicle in the absence of a written constitution or an established solution for these issues. A major reform of the House requires a means of establishing consensus, such as a constitutional convention of some kind, followed by an Act of Parliament for implementation. And when I was on the front bench in Scotland in the 1990s with George Robertson, we were involved in that constitutional convention, engaging society. More incremental reform of the House might, however, only require an independent, broad-based consultation and recommendation, with more limited proposals captured in legislation. And I've been in conversation with Lord Burns on a number of occasions in recent months. I know, and Lord Fowler knows, that his cross-party committee, which continues in existence and has produced further reports, stands ready to help us in engaging sensibly on this. The committee has worked extremely well, the cross-party committee, in seeking compromise and consensus around the House, and is keen to continue its work. In light of the current debate and the sharp focus on our chamber, it is, in my opinion, essential that Lord Burns and his colleagues continue to take this forward. With the right support, the committee could reach out beyond the House to engage in a fundamental consensus-based review of workable options, setting out recommendations for a way forward. Consensus via the right reform vehicle is vital, but this can only be delivered if a further prerequisite is satisfied, and that requirement is for the government to be engaged in the issue and to be involved in a dialogue which can lead to delivery. It is worth recalling that the 2019 Conservative Election Manifesto included reference to looking, quote, at the role of the House of Lords, unquote, among other constitutional questions. In the spirit of engagement in the summer, I wrote to both Conservative leadership election candidates seeking commitment and collaboration on the issue of Lords reform. Rishi Sunak responded positively to me, saying that these issues were, and I quote, important constitutional questions which need to be considered in detail, and that a Prime Minister should make time for a meeting to consider this further. I agree, and I'm taking him up on his offer. Engagement with the government at the highest level is of central importance in driving a way forward as part of a consensus-based, viable approach to reform. The House of Lords needs to keep up with the times. If it doesn't, it faces decline, and that's bad for our politics and our democracy. We need to work proactively to change the Lords so that we can continue to do what we do well, but do it while better reflecting society in all parts of the country as part of the UK Parliament. Hence, my two unassailable truths. First, the House of Lords adds significant value to parliamentary scrutiny and revision, distinct from and complementary to the Commons. Second, while the House of Lords is able to add value because its composition is different from the Commons, there are also issues around our composition which we need to resolve. And following on from that, I will conclude by reminding you of my principles for reform of the Lords. First, changing the composition will inevitably change the role and behaviour, even if there are no explicit changes in the powers. Second, the more radical the change, the more radical and unpredictable perhaps will be the resulting change in the role of the Lords. And radical change may well be possible, but it requires consensus for delivery. And hence, my third principle, we need reform proposals to achieve engagement and endorsement from government and all political parties and wider society. And we need to choose the right vehicle to accomplish sustainable, consensual change. The work, initiative, dedication and thought being put in by the Lords and its members gives me hope for the future. I believe the House collectively wants to be smaller, and I know that the House has a good track record of pursuing reform. With conversation, collaboration, commitment, I'm optimistic that we can deliver the consensus required to ensure that our reformed upper chamber can continue to perform effectively as part of a modern parliamentary democracy fit for the 21st century. Thank you.